Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Experimental Publishing Futures panel. So I'm Janneke Adema. I'm Associate Professor of Digital Media at Coventry University. And I will be co-chairing this panel together with Simon Bowie, who is a digital library software developer at the University of Edinburgh Library. And we're both members, Simon, former member of the Experimental Publishing Group. And we've got two other members of that group with us here today, Julia McCarty and Rebecca Kiesewetter, who will be monitoring all the online chats and questions. So one of the things that we want to do today is focus maybe less on what we have done as a group over the last 3 years as part of the Open Book Futures project, because we will still be having a final conference in which we will be sharing all the things that we've learned and the things that we've achieved, which will take place on the 8th and 9th of April. And there is a save the date already on our documentation site on copim.pod to have a look at that. And I think Rebecca and Julian will also be sharing some information about that to the online people. So please come to that if you can. It's going to be fantastic. But today what we're going to do is we wanted to bring together, because I think quite a lot has happened in the last 6 years since we've been starting to do this work on experimental publishing. And in the Copim project, we've engaged a lot with scholar-led presses. And during the Open Book Futures project, we've increasingly also started to engage with university presses. And so we've brought together three representatives from UK university presses that have all kind of been on a journey, I would say, towards or kind of exploring experimental publishing. And so we're really happy to today have with us representative from the University of London Press, Westminster University Press and Bristol University Press. And the way that we're going to run this panel is that they'll give some short presentations around their works or thoughts or ideas around experimental publishing. And after that, Simon and I will be leading a discussion with the panelists based on some pre-prepared questions. And then we'll be leaving a little bit of time at the end also for questions. But we're also hoping that if you've got any questions online, Rebecca and Julian know everything about experimental publishing, so they'll be able to help you with that too. We're going to start off with Emma, who is joining us from online. I hope you can hear us all well, Emma, and everything is well on your side. So Emma Gannon is the publisher at the University of London Press, which is a predominantly open access press which focus on humanities research. And she joined University of London Press in 2021 and has over 15 years of experience in editorial roles in scholarly publishing. And her particular interests include open access in the humanities, experimental books, and the relationship between open research and research culture. And prior to her publishing career, Emma completed a PhD in music at Lancaster University. So, Emma, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janneke. I hope you can all hear me fine, and I will just share my slides. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my slides okay there. So thank you very much again, Janneke, and to Simon as well for the invitation to participate in this experimental publishing panel. It's a pleasure to do so, albeit virtually, and a pleasure to present alongside John and Paul as well.
Sure.
So as Janneke said, I'm the publisher at the University of London Press, and I lead the new commissioning and look after the editorial side of things at the press. And for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a small, predominantly open access university press based within the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. We publish around 20 books a year across the humanities disciplines, the majority of which are open access without author charges, thanks to our support from the School of Advanced Study and other collective open access funding schemes that we participate in, including the Open Book Collective. And we focus our publishing on work that highlights the importance of humanities research and opens up debate. So an explicit part of our remit to push humanities scholarship in new directions is to experiment with what's possible for open access publishing and its form, its content, workflow and aims. And we dedicate space in our publishing programme for at least a couple of experimental book projects a year. We work with the Manifold platform and have set up our own instance of this to help facilitate our experiments. So Manifold enables publication of enhanced open access editions of our books in flexible formats with multimedia resources embedded. And it also offers a variety of interactive reader engagement and annotation tools. And I'll just briefly introduce you to some of our recent and forthcoming experimental and enhanced books to show you some examples. So we ran an open peer review process for the draft chapters for Reframing Failure in Digital Scholarship, which is edited by Anna Maria Sacciani and Michael Donnay. And this felt like a very fitting way to carry out the peer review for this book, given its subject matter, which is very much centered around experimentation, transparency, and collaboration as part of the value of failing better in digital scholarship. So for this process, the reviewers used the annotation functionality in Manifold to leave their comments openly for the volume editors, for the authors, and the other reviewers to see. And they could also comment on each other's comments as well, which was a really valuable part of the process. So secondly, Women Working the Past by Mara Thornton and Catherine Harlow arose from a digital humanities project that produced a large open database of women active in archaeology, history and heritage professions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we're going to be publishing an open access edition of this in the autumn that makes use of all the project outputs, including embedding links to the database throughout, audio recordings and interactive data visualizations. So Living with Machines is a real flagship publication for us. And it's coming out of the UKRI-funded Living with Machines project, which was a huge interdisciplinary collaboration carried out at the Alan Turing Institute, the British Library, and 5 partner universities. And it was looking at data-driven methods of exploring the extraordinary impact of technology on human lives in Britain's Industrial Revolution. The book is being collectively authored by the Living with Machines team and is an ongoing, highly experimental and quite exciting publishing project for us in 3 main ways. So we have published the draft chapters openly and iteratively on Manifold, by which I mean that we took a phased approach to the release, review and revision for the chapters. And this both allowed public access to the very timely research in the early versions of the chapters while they were being reviewed, and it enabled us to learn from and refine our new workflows with each release stage. We also carried out an open peer review process for the draft chapters in pretty much the same way as the Reframing Failure book. And the research project itself generated a wealth of original outputs, including large open data sets, interactive data visualizations, code repositories, video, digital notebooks, methods papers, more. And the integration of these materials is an essential part of the vision for this book in order to draw together and maximize the project's outputs. And this will make it easier for the other researchers to access, reuse, and build upon research data and the findings. And we're now working towards final publication of this book towards the end of the year. So for this panel, we were asked to talk about how we see experimental publishing changing and developing in the future. And from our work, especially on Living with Machines, but equally in general, as I learn more about this area, 3 main reflections have come to mind. So the first is that experimental publishing is increasingly blurring the distinction between where the research project stops and the publishing process begins. So this isn't anything new, and it isn't only a feature of experimental books. So traditionally published monographs, especially in the humanities, where the writing can very much be the research itself, they've always collapsed boundaries between scholarship and publication. But for complex experimental book projects, my experience so far is that more and more we're seeing researchers approaching publishers much sooner in the research process for their expertise and simply for finding out what might be possible with the development and design of the outputs of experimental projects, which are an integral part of and will help to inform the research itself. With the Living with Machines book, it's been really exciting to embrace new forms of collaboration with the authors, but it's also been crucial to put proper structures in place to scaffold those collaborations. And for us, this meant a higher degree of project planning in the early stages in comparison with more standard book projects. And this involved agreeing clear timelines, milestones, and responsibilities. And holding a kickoff meeting for the project was a really useful part of this, as well as regular evaluation points and creating space for frequent open communication. And just finally on this point, open peer review is of course much more likely to be a collaborative process between reviewers, authors and publishers as an intrinsic part of developing the ongoing research ideas, with reviewers credited for their input, rather than the kind of summative judgment that more traditional peer review can end up being, or perceived as being. So my next point is that experimental publishing continues to be resource and labour intensive, and this won't come as a surprise to anybody, but these projects do require a lot of work. So for us as publishers, we've had to develop completely new workflows for living with machines, involving much closer working than normal between editorial and production colleagues, particularly around checking and preparing submitted material, ensuring version control, and managing responsibilities for liaising with authors. We've produced documentation for managing iterative projects now, and we've actually seen a lot of benefit for all of our book publishing by having a closer understanding of each function's concerns. But as a tiny team of just 2 people in editorial and production, this took a lot of skills development and trial and error. Although we have been lucky to be able to benefit from support that's out there, such as from the Copim Experimental Publishing Group's activities and information, and from Janneke's work. And it's really reinforced the real importance of being able to access community-led sharing of learnings, guidance and support among those who are working in this area. So for researchers as well, the Living with Machines authors have put in a huge amount of work, and particularly in preparing their resources for this kind of multimodal publication, along with accompanying metadata for every single resource. And we have to be really mindful of the current higher education context when thinking about the work that these projects demand. So humanities departments are being decimated, ECRs are having to drop out of academia at significant rates, and research posts on funded experimental projects end when the project concludes, whether that book is published yet or not. So with all that in mind, who's there to be doing the experimenting? And this point leads nicely onto my third reflection, which is that there's a reciprocal relationship between experimental publishing and positive open research cultures. And by this, I mean that experimental book projects can offer many benefits that are the hallmarks of a healthy research culture. So wider sharing of findings, collaboration and inclusion, public engagement, improved research integrity, and the list goes on. But these projects can only really happen if the research culture and environment allows that space to experiment, to fail and take risks, and to share transparently in the first place. And there's a lot of useful work going on at universities to support positive research cultures, as I think was also mentioned in the session previously. And as well as, for example, the work of the Morphs project led by Sam Moore at Cambridge, which is looking at open research specifically in the humanities and social sciences. And this kind of work is very encouraging for future developments, I think. There's a role for publishers to play as well in creating the conditions for a culture that allow experimentation. And the thread that connects my 3 reflections is the increasing importance of publishers being, and importantly, being perceived as being collaborators with authors, rather than solely as providers of a service or yoke and gatekeepers. There's a lot that's already been said about collaboration at this conference, but just in terms of the future of experimental publishing, the increase in the last decade in small open access, scholar-led, library and university presses, and that, for example, are taking learnings from their work on developing OERs into new ways of publishing monographs, or that have experimentation as a central part of their mission, like us at UOL Press, and are ready and waiting to collaborate, I think is a cause to feel optimistic overall about experimental books' futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. Can I invite John over? Talk back for you. So John Atkinson is the press manager of the University of Westminster Press. Oh, sorry, go for it. And John's worked across the range of very big presses or commercial presses and the smallest presses, his own author. And he's also been kind of doing all the kinds of roles that are involved in the publishing business, from commissioning editors to sales and marketing manager. But he's currently the manager of the pioneering open access publisher University of Westminster Press, in which capacity he also sits on the OIPA steering committee. And currently John is helping to steer the experimental publishing project, Deep Maps Blue Humanities, which is part of one of the 3 pilots that we're running as part of the Open Book Futures project. And John, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Very good, thank you. So, as Janneke has said, I'm a career publisher. There's no need to boo or anything. Who's worked in a variety of large and small academic publishers, and I've also run my own small press. And I suspect that my familiarity with and experience of experimental publishing is fairly typical of someone with this career path. Which is to say that if you're looking for any answers to questions around the future of experimental publishing, then I suggest you take this opportunity to pop down to Westfield and do some shopping, because I have no answers, but I do have some thoughts and I do have some questions of my own. I should say, I'm going to be using a couple of examples from a presentation I gave some months ago on this similar subject, so apologies to those of you who witnessed that particular triumph. At UWP, we're in the home straight of preparing an experimental publication, which I'll return to presently. But first I want to illustrate how my own personal understanding of what constitutes experimental publishing, or enhanced publishing, has developed. So my first exposure was via the Manifold platform, which Emma referenced, which is in use at Liverpool University Press, where I worked between 2020 and 2023. LUP was, I think, you might correct me, the first UK publisher to adopt Manifold, and you can see 4 books at the foot of the slide there. Which used it. So my understanding of what Manifold was then amounts to it being an opportunity to make available supporting material to help contextualize the primary text. It could perhaps be annotated archive evidence that would be difficult to display on a printed page. It could be a data set, which again would not be economical or even legible in print. It might be a photographic record of a practice-based research that the book is an output from. I should say that this somewhat reductive summary is my own, and I'm not using LUP as an illustration. I'm not suggesting this is the totality of how they use it, or indeed of Manifold's capabilities. I think Emma illustrated before. It can do more than that. What I'm describing here are essentially enhancements to the traditional monograph. Welcome, certainly, and in some cases arguably essential in properly conveying the context from which the book emerged. But it's essentially supporting documentation or appendices. The next step along from this might be using the conventions of editorial oversight and peer review in the service of a research output that defies traditional scholarly publishing formats. And an example of that is I Used to Love to Dream, a peer-reviewed hip-hop album. That sounded very white, didn't it? Peer-reviewed hip-hop album that was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2020 and authored by A.D. Carson of the University of Virginia. And in UMP, he found a willing and open-minded collaborator. As the quotation on the slide from Carson about UMP says, they understood what they didn't understand, and some of the limitations of what they believed they could do, and being honest with people about these kinds of things is a way to build trust. And I think this is an important observation and one I'll return to. And so what does a peer-reviewed hip-hop record look like? Well, this is a grab from the Fulcrum publishing platform, enabling the integration of audio, video, interactive maps, and 3D models directly into scholarly books, which was developed by UMP and Michigan Library, and full disclosure is now the host of the UWP website. And while it looks like any other kind of traditional academic press website, Fulcrum's technical underpinning to support non-traditional publishing becomes more evident as you explore. So you can read the I Used to Love to Dream digital book, which is basically sort of CD liner notes, and you can watch a 30-minute film about the project, and there's the option to stream individual tracks from the album. So this is actually quite a fun and very accessible experimentally published work, yet one which is also firmly scholar-led insofar as it meets the needs of the academic to have the totality of their work represented in a way that traditional academic publishing just can't do. So it's conceptually experimental, even if, in terms of the technology supporting it, it isn't actually that sophisticated. The experimental nature of it lies in the fact that, until recently, a scholarly publication could not consist of these elements. But it's not using the technology in an experimental way per se, or using the form to comment on the content. At the far end of the spectrum, or at least as far as my limited imagination can conceive, is a work in progress between UWP and Open Book Futures' experimental publishing group. I make no apologies for saying that Deep Maps, Blue Humanities is a difficult project to summarize in a short presentation. So here's my best shot. It explores deep mapping in content and form, and does so by visualizing a process of mapping the depths of the ocean as a meta-commentary on the layering of lots of different types of content. And the reader engages with it through a non-linear interaction with text, illustration, and moving image. It's authored using Markdown, a markup language that can be converted to HTML, and Juncture, a tool that allows the dynamic display of text and other media, which has been developed by JSTOR Labs. If you're looking to catalogue deep maps by discipline, you'd probably say that it's an exploration of the Anthropocene and issues arising. But it's also a way to interrogate our own understanding of what experimental publishing even is, so that the end product is, and of itself, a commentary on research practice, which is light years along the evolutionary spectrum from the uses that Manifold was being put to when I first encountered it just half a decade ago. Which brings us back to the question, how are experimental and enhanced books changing scholarly publishing? A question I put to our AI overlords in the form of Microsoft Copilot. And you can see that I've fully embraced the AI cliches and illustrated the slide with a murderous computer HAL 9000 from 2001. And while some of Copilot's responses seemed entirely reasonable, they were all inflected by a slightly queasy feeling that my non-sentient friend was telling me exactly what it thought I wanted to hear. For example, it advised that experimental book publishing is challenging traditional monograph forms, which is surely incontestable. If you're a dance researcher, for example, and you've historically had to transpose your practice research into the rigorously policed structures of a journal article, the possibility of supplementing or even replacing that with moving image output is almost by definition going to result in a greater appreciation of it, which in turn gives greater urgency and legitimacy to the need to revise how academic work is evaluated. The output may not appear in a 3 or 4 star ranked journal, but if it gets 100,000 views online and there's evidence of open peer review, how is it less valid than an article which a beleaguered editor has accepted for a journal with an audience in the low hundreds, whose greedy proprietor has insisted must double its output? So there are some unalloyed potential positives. But Copilot also asserted that through experimental book publishing, we can all look forward to a rosy future of open access and equity and community-led initiatives. And I'm afraid I don't accept that the one automatically follows the other, and I refer you to the aforementioned greedy publishers. If the big corporations are allowed to take the lead, our authors may have little choice but to play along. Yes, our sector is under strain, but it remains vital that researchers continue to push the boundaries to ensure that genuine OA and equity remain at the heart of the spirit of inquiry. And publishers like UWP and others here today do our bit to champion that work to provide a robust and truly scholar-led alternative. Parenthetically, I finished writing this presentation about a week ago, so I felt gratified that I I heard Janneke and Joe yesterday giggling down on the centrality of the scholar-led principle. A big question for me is around peer review. How does one peer review a hip-hop record, for example, without resorting to journalism or music critique? Sarah Jo Cohen, the editor at Michigan for I Used to Love to Dream, has said the peer reviewers, quote, really focus their comments on the scholarly interventions that the project is making, the importance of this intervention, and how to best present this project so that it could reach the widest possible audience, unquote. It seems to me what Cohen is saying is that the reviewer didn't really engage with the material in a way that one for a conventional scholarly manuscript might. Rather, that the act of peer reviewing one is in of itself a sort of validation for its academic credibility, which I think speaks to a tension in how conventions of scholarly publishing intersect with projects like this.
Right.
So, to wrap up, and to persist with the 2001 reference, I feel a bit like one of Kubrick's disconcerted apes in the Dream of Man sequence, experience an evolutionary shock in a landscape that's remained essentially unchanged for a long time. I'm realizing that experimental publishing isn't just about non-traditional formats, although it is that, but it's also about how knowledge is created, shared, and valued. It's also made me reflect on the publisher's role as both the conduit for research and indeed what even constitutes publishing, as we have traditionally thought of it. As per A.D. Carson's observations about his relationship with UMP on I Used to Love to Dream, the willingness on the part of the publisher to both try new things but also to accept that one is in uncharted territory become crucial ingredients in the experimental publishing cocktail. We need to accept the possibility that concepts like peer review and editorial oversight will necessarily be redefined. And this is the tricky bit, except at the risk and vulnerability that comes with that. Even if, in experimental publishing terms, you're still a prehistoric ape. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sean. That was wonderful. Paul, can I invite you over?
Yeah, not together.
Why not on?
Yeah, just.
Paul Stevens is publisher at Bristol University Press, which is based in the university's Faculty of Arts, Law and Social Sciences. And he acquires new book projects in science and technology studies and research methods and practices. And
Thank you very much for having me. I've got to admit, when Janneke invited me along, I was a bit unsure about joining the panel because, unlike some publishers, Bristol doesn't really have much of a reputation for doing much experimental publishing. Our catalogue can be described as being fairly conventional. But what I hope is going to be helpful is the perspective that I bring concerning the types of challenges that presses such as Bristol face when they try to do things differently. I'm not going to try and claim to speak on behalf of an entire section of the university press world because, as we know, it's so diverse. But I do think that Bristol can be broadly representative of a particular type of press in this part of the world and at this moment in time. And to understand our perspective on experimentation, it'll be helpful to position Bristol in the field. I joined BEP when it was formally established in 2016 as a department within the faculty. It's a not-for-profit publisher, and it's one that the university's been happy to support given the symbolic value of having an in-house press. But given the level of financial investment that the university made, the intention from the outset was to grow quickly and to become as financially self-sufficient as possible in order to be not too significant a drain on the institution's budget. And in the subsequent decade, we've reached a steady state of publishing between 200 and 250 books a year.
Good. Yeah.
Like comparable university presses, open access has become a fairly significant part of what we do, although this remains uneven across the books program. So, for example, in STS, which is my main area, I'd estimate that around a third of my acquisitions are for books that will be published OA. but we have subject lists where there is currently far less demand for open access. So anyway, we publish a fairly significant number of titles, and now we sit in what you might call the awkward middle of the field. We don't have the resources of the bigger university presses, but at the same time, we are obviously larger than the presses represented here, where there's sometimes the bandwidth to devote to experimental projects and to make them normal practice. We're large enough to appreciate some of the economies of scale in terms of our editorial and production workflows, but with that, we've come to recognize that this places very real constraints on what is considered practical in terms of our publishing. So I'll explain what I mean. When BP was set up, we had two stated goals. One was to champion interdisciplinary publishing, and the other was to challenge scholarly boundaries, which is always a little broadly defined, but it held this idea of questioning established ideas of what sorts of books a press might produce. These might sound like buzzwords, but there was something going on here. As an upstart publisher, there was, and there still is, a lot of well-intentioned thinking about what a new university press could and should do differently. 10 years on, I think we've done a good job on the goal of promoting interdisciplinarity, and that's evident in our commitment to fields like STS, which, as we know, don't fit neatly into typical boxes. But it's fair to say that we face challenges when it comes to the second goal. Now, I hate to say it, but the primary constraint is imposed by the market. There can be a sense of risk aversion amongst presses that have to balance their not-for-profit mission status against the institutional demands to break even or not to be too great a drain on the budget. So bluntly, we have to be prudent. For instance, in the early days of COVID, BEP experimented with a new format that we called rapid responses. These were extremely short interventions into journalistic and policy debates, and they're entirely digital, and they could be published within a matter of weeks. They were conceived and presented to the world as a challenge to established publishing conventions. It was an experiment. But we found that there was little appetite from the market for them, and we've since discontinued the format. The issue wasn't the quality of the work. In terms of citations and downloads, these rapid responses were comparable to more conventional books. The issue was that the market didn't know what to do with this kind of format. We're continually told that library purchasing budgets are largely structured around standard monographs and collections, and distributors didn't have a neat category for them either. So what this means in practice is that experimentation ends up getting done within tightly prescribed boundaries and at the margins. As you'll all know, the publishing chain has become much more complex in recent years, funneling out to a wider range of vendors and aggregators and intermediaries. So our books have to flow seamlessly through this chain so that people can find them and acquire them. So stretching an organization's imaginative horizons needs to be balanced with a need to think in terms of books that can be recognized easily and unproblematically by humans and automated systems as conventional books. Digital technologies mean that it's easier now to develop non-linear multimodal projects, but the necessities of market legibility have an inhibiting effect. So that's one thing, but there are secondary constraints which I think are potentially more interesting. Getting to a situation where you're publishing a couple of hundred books a year involves from doing absolutely everything in-house to increasingly outsourcing parts of your operation. So as many of you know, when you're a very small team doing everything in-house, you can easily walk over to your production colleagues and say, can we try something completely different with this manuscript? But greater scale can come with greater reliance on external publishing services, and this necessarily leads to more standardized workflows and templates that are designed to turn text into books as efficiently as possible. And standardization becomes a dominant frame of reference within a press. It becomes harder to shift the needle on what might be possible. So a bespoke experimental project essentially breaks the standard production pipeline, which means that it requires bespoke project management. So the financial impact of experimentation might be negligible, but the perceived opportunity costs become significant. And when the focus is on building capacity for the level of throughput that will allow you to become self-supporting, you get very good at doing a particular kind of thing well. It sort of creates path dependencies and shapes the kind of expertise that you keep in-house.
Yes. So even as the technological barriers fall and the economies of scale, I'll just carry on. The economies of scale would appear to favour experimentation, it becomes constrained by
bureaucratic and practical reality. Now, I realize that all of this might sound a little bit gloomy, but in being frank about what presses like Bristol are contending with, I'm not looking to suggest that university presses like mine can afford to sidestep the opportunities and the obligations to experiment. I think that I'm here does demonstrate that there's a willingness in my corner of the university press world to try and anticipate the future and to think very seriously about the role that these types of publishers might play. Presses like Bristol are well-intentioned, but over the years it's become clearer to me that intention is sometimes misaligned with the architecture that's needed for experimentation, and that many university presses feel nervous about changing their recipes. If we're going to try and think, if we're going to try and do things differently and in a more confident manner, then we need to learn from the expertise, community-led infrastructures that you're building. There's an elephant in the room that I think needs to be addressed. Generative AI is a challenge to publishers of all types, and there are potential opportunities for repurposing and recasting works that I think presses will start to probe at in the next couple of years, and probably sooner rather than later. I'm speculating, but we may imminently see workflows developing on parallel lines. So a monograph might be produced in its most conventional and legible sense, but simultaneously it could be recast as something more experimental and interactive. I'll be honest, as a publisher, I'm intrigued by that possibility, but we obviously can't and we mustn't overlook the ethical questions that would raise. In the absence of the ability to develop proprietary systems, presses will be reliant on using models that are owned and maintained by an obviously extractive big tech industry. I don't have the answers to those sorts of questions posed, but if we're interested in the future infrastructures of experimental open access publishing, then I think that this should be a site of activity, and I hope collaboration across communities. So if there's a way for me to sum up, I think the future of experimental publishing, it doesn't just have to be about what a vanguard might achieve in isolation. That awkward middle of the university press field can be usefully recruited to work with your community. I'm not going to try and make a pitch for anyone's labour, but I just want to say that presses like Bristol are absolutely watching what you're doing. We want to be learning from what you're doing, and we'd very much like to have conversations in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. All right, I think we can keep the microphone around this area a little bit, and I'm just going to move this so we can see Emma a little bit on our side. Yes, okay, thank you so much. All right, I'm going to start us off with a question for the panel, so thank you all very much. Just give me a second. So I want to start off a little bit with, just to get us started, like examples of experimental books, and I know that we've mentioned a few already in the presentations, but examples of experimental books that really kind of that you admire and that you found interesting. And then I'm specifically interesting in those kinds of examples that were only possible in an experimental form, so they would not have a print equivalent. And I'm wondering, have you come across any of these? Have you come across these from books you've published or that you've kind of really admired? And could you share some of us? And I might ask Emma to answer that question first, if that's okay.
Yep. So the one that springs to mind is As I Remember It, which is published by the University of British Columbia Press, and it was on their Ravenspace platform. And this is a multimodal publication of the teachings of Elsie Paul, who is an Indigenous Siaman elder. And it's just this really beautiful example of immersive digital storytelling. It's laid out in a non-linear way, so you can kind of explore your way into the publication. There's interactive maps. But I think importantly, and in response to the main thrust of your question, Janneke, it includes lots of clips of Elsie Paul sharing her stories herself. And it was really vital for this to be kind of in audio for this book, because it allows, that kind of respects the oral tradition that the book wanted to have. And also it allows the readers to engage with the Sliaman language in the form of sound and through Elsie Paul's voice, as well as reading about it in the text. So I thought that was a really nice example. It won the ACLS and Arcadia Multimodal Publication Prize back in 2024 as well. And yeah, it's a really lovely book.
Thanks so much, Emma. As I remember it, check it out, everybody, if you don't know it already. It is absolutely amazing. John, do you have an example too of a book that inspired you?
I mean, I would refer you again to the example I did in my presentation that from Michigan. I used to love to dream because, as I said in the presentation, the form that publication takes is only possible through enhanced and experimental publishing, and going back to the kind of scholar-led principle, the author's work would not have been represented fairly if he'd have had to put it in between covers or in a PDF format, and also it's a fun thing as well. I think we bandy around words like experimental publishing, and if you're anything like me, you're slightly terrified at the prospect of engaging with it. But that's an example for me, which is both open access and extremely accessible in the widest term.
Well,
yeah, I think DMAPs looks terrific. I have a really. I'm not going to look at it either. I have a deep-seated fear of the sea and of sharks. So as intriguing as it is, I think I'm going to steer clear of it. I'm going to give a really weak answer to it. That might say more about my psychology as a career publisher. But we're thinking about this. I was thinking back on books that I admire greatly. Examples might include Malcolm Ashmore's The Reflexive Thesis and Anne-Marie Moore's The Body Multiple. I think that those are terrific books that frustrate the linearity of academic writing. But what's interesting about those books is that, going back to my earlier point, from a distance, they're still packaged and they still circulate as conventional books, putting quotes around the word. They're not profound interventions into form as such. I think that speaks to what I was saying about experimentation still needing to be made legible and to act as publications so they can be counted in a certain sense.
I think this has all been very positive, like especially co-pilots, very optimistic answers about the future. Very cheery, very cheery. But Emma, you alluded to like some of the resource and labour intensivity of experimental books, and I want to ask the panel about what kind of barriers do you see to authors publishing experimental books? Like what might put off authors, and how do we start to address those things as publishers?
Oh, it's a good question, and there are so many different answers. But I think one of the main things, actually, in my experience, it's kind of outside of fields such as digital humanities, for example. There is a bit of a widespread lack of awareness of what can be done, what the possibilities are, and actually why, for authors, it might be useful to think about publishing their research in different ways. Like, what will they get out of it? Because they're, as you say, they're having to put a lot into it in terms of time and skills development. And I think related to that as well, I think approaching a publisher to have a conversation, to pitch a new book project can be quite a nervy thing for some authors, particularly ECRs. And approaching a publisher with a very complex idea for a book proposal, might lead to a greater likelihood of that publisher just flat out saying no. So why would you do it? So I think somebody has linked in the chat here about the Copim Experimental Publishing Compendium and the work of the group, and I think that's been great for awareness raising, and I think just the importance of that, should only be increased. And I think publishers who are working in this space, I think we could do a better job as well of promoting what we're doing in this area and signalling, the kinds of projects that we're looking for, and really explaining to authors why it will be useful for their particular research to present it in kind of different modes and ways.
Since I have the mic, I'll go next. I think we've also got to look at what happens upstream. A couple of years ago, there was a really interesting article that was published about the publication practices of STS scholars, and if I'm not misremembering, it sort of reflected on how some of those like meta-literary sensibilities that we associate with classic science and technology studies were sort of massaged out of the field, not necessarily by publishers, but by this sort of self-imposed standardization in which authors felt that they were having to act on concerns that their research and that their publications had to be made feasible or legible. So publishers absolutely have a role to play in this, but I think it's important to attend to what is happening before it gets to publishers.
Well, I agree with that completely, and I think I've had I've had conversations with early career researchers about not necessarily about particularly experimental types of publishing, but just about even just going down the open access route. And I've had people say to me, "This is great. I'd love to do this, but." The head of my research center says if it's not in a 3 or 4 star journal, it doesn't exist. I had in a previous life working inside HE. I'm relatively new to working inside HE. I had someone describe the research center director to me as, this wasn't Janneke by the way, as the devil, because this guy said there's just no way he would even contemplate me going down the route you're proposing. So as a publisher who's we want to publish stuff. We want to publish interesting research, especially in those kind of interdisciplinary spaces where the quite traditionally siloed nature of university press publishing doesn't really know quite what to do with it. But if you've got your potential author's boss saying, don't do that, what are they meant to do?
Thanks. I'm wondering, kind of moving away a little bit from barriers then towards what has been working, right? So I think we've got examples of 3 presses there that, are willing on the one hand to are already kind of fully experimenting, I would say. And I'm just wondering, what kind of conversations have you had internally within your presses to get to this point, or are you trying to get to this point maybe? And similarly maybe with authors, right? Because I imagine you'll on the one hand experience authors who are really interested in experimental publishing, or maybe you're also meeting authors where you see their book proposal and think, wow, this would really do with some enhancement or some kind of multimodality, but they're not necessarily there. So what kind of conversations have you been having that maybe have moved things forward a little bit? And shall we start with Emma again?
So we're really lucky at the School of Advanced Study to be based in an institution which has a really thriving digital humanities hub. And it's been really great, actually, both to learn from colleagues in the hub and to discuss project ideas with them. So I think it's about identifying those people who are already kind of working in that space. And we've started, some nice new book projects with those colleagues, and then allowing those projects to be used as models for other authors, and kind of spread the word by allowing others to see really tangible examples of what's working. As I said, we have been lucky. We haven't had to kind of come across institutional barriers for us to be able to start doing some experimenting. The barriers for us personally, they're more kind of around time, funding and resources and skills development. But in terms of the motivation to start these projects, we do have some excellent colleagues that we're working with. So mobilise your champions is probably my takeaway from that.
Unfortunately, I am holding the mic. Truthfully, not many, in all honesty. I mean, in part because I'm relatively new to Westminster. I've been in post less than 12 months. And I've spent most of my time trying to, find out how SharePoint works and things like that. But I should say that Westminster actually is very well placed for doing more experimental and kind of multimedia material, in that it has an excellent reputation in practice research. And the press sits in the scholarly comms team, and my manager is the lead in a multi-institution project to develop the practice research repository. So I'm hopeful that in time that might translate into some publishing opportunities.
Thanks. So I suppose I have to distinction between different types of experimentation, sort of that low experimentation and high experimentation. In terms of what we're doing with the books, not push too hard. I recently published this lovely book called Revisiting Reflexivity, and one of the chapters is presented as a set of handwritten notes. It's a little hard to explain, but I've got a copy in my bag if anyone wants to take a look. But when I received the files, I thought this was going to make my production colleague's head explode. Because how do you make that a thing? But it proved to be entirely uncontroversial.
I think because that sort of templarization of academic production workflows,
it's been a bit harder with that higher, more radical experimentation. We have a digital library platform that holds all of our books and our journal articles. And periodically there are conversations in-house about how we can use that platform to develop and to host these more imaginative, multimodal projects. And there's always a lot of interest, but those conversations never seem to go too far, I think, because of time, as I've said, but bandwidth, huge, yeah, but also the sort of the financial costs that are associated with reconfiguring these platforms, because we didn't build that software in-house. It was an off-the-rack piece of software that we bought. So yeah, there's interest there, but it's finding ways to push it on. But I think coming to a conference like this and just taking part in the panel is going to be something that moves it on. This has been a great opportunity to reflect. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I think speaking of the conference, like community has been such a huge word for the past 2 days, and obviously hugely important to what Copim does and Open Book Futures. I think one of the great things about experimental books, from my perspective, is their ability to build community around a text. So whether that's through different kinds of peer review, or Emma, you talked about comments and annotations on a book. I'm interested in, as publishers, what do you think is the role of the publisher in that context? Like, is it the role of the publisher to stimulate this community around books, or is that solely the preserve of the author or researcher? What do you think?
Shall I go first? Okay. For me, it comes back to this idea that like publishers are never passive, right? The academic book has its own sort of distinctive art world where we're used to thinking in terms of the publishing chain or the value chain, but that presumes a sort of certain linearity of communication. The reality, books are networked, they're achievements, right? And they're performed, and all those nodes are sort of sites of negotiation and influence. So publishers absolutely have a role to play in that community forming, because I don't think it can be otherwise. Whether you think publishers should be playing a role is perhaps going to depend on your politics.
Well, I mean, as I said towards the end of my presentation, I think it's in flux basically, and I think the publisher has as an obligation really to remain open and not insist that there is a way of doing things when the way of doing things is transparently different from a 90,000 word monograph, you know. I'm going to point over to Julian here, who's from Copim, who's been involved in the Deep Maps book that we're working on, and he might say otherwise, but I think Westminster role and my involvement has been as a facilitator as much as anything, and I think there are things that there's a skill set that with a publishing background can bring to it, and a knowledge of when to sort of dip in and out. I mean, for example, the authored material in Deep Maps is currently being copy edited. Now, the Deep Maps publication might change over the years, and as bits of content get dropped in or pulled out, but there's a responsibility on the publisher's part for there to be kind of a baseline of competence. But it's not for me to get involved in the back end of it, because I don't need to be an expert in that. It's the publisher's job to identify who the experts are, empower them to get on with it, put some guidelines in place, and see what happens.
Emma, do you want to come in on that?
I guess just to pick up on your point about reviewer engagement with open peer review process, Simon. So for the Living with Machines project, we kind of just approached the reviewers, sent them the instructions and left them to, annotate their chapters. And I would say that was probably only moderately successful in terms of reviewer engagement. And it really has hammered home to me the importance of the publisher's role in stimulating this community engagement. A couple of the reviewers completely independently came to me and said it would be a useful part of the process if we were running it again in future to set up kind of a discussion with the authors once they'd seen the text, so they could have that extra connection with the authors rather than just, even though their names were openly added to the comments, it still felt like a bit of an anonymous process, I guess, to them. So yes, I do think the publishers have a huge role to play in stimulating this engagement, as Paul said, but it's something that the authors can get involved with as well.
Cool, thank you.
Alex.
Yeah, do we have any online questions for the panel? Yes, a vigorous nod.
Yeah, or also probably be correct for CO2.
Yes.
So this question is initially for Emma. You mentioned that your press's publishing is Diamond Open Access, paid by the London University School of Advanced Studies. Would you be able to describe the system you have in place for deciding which publication submissions are funded? This would be very helpful to understand as they're involved in setting this up at their university. And they're also just wondering, is it harder for experimental proposals to get Diamond OA funding?
So the way it works at our price, our mission and our remit is very, very closely aligned with the School of Advanced Studies strategy, which is to support the advancement of humanities research in several key strategic areas, which I won't go into. But basically, every proposal that we have to put forward has to align with one of these key strategic areas. We can only publish 20 proposals a year, and I receive between 5 and 10 times the number of proposals for that. So we have to kind of really closely stick to that remit. And if those books that we put forward, align and go through peer review process, fine. We have the open access funding available from our school to publish those. As I said, we also participate in some other collective publishing schemes. We have some successful knowledge and latch funding, for example. The JISC Open Access Community Fund has funded a number of our publications in the past, and we're continually exploring other ways to publish our books through other collective schemes in that way too. But that's roughly how it works. In terms of experimental publishing, getting funding, no, that isn't more difficult in terms of what the school will and won't fund. We have a publishing committee that kind of approves all of our proposals, and because experimentation really is a key part of the press remit and the school's remit as well, I think that still is quite a central thing for them to want to fund open access for. So yes, we are in an extremely lucky situation there. I do recognise that.
Great. I think that brings us to time. Yeah. So thank you, all our panelists. Thank you, Emma, John, Paul. Thank you very much. I believe it's now time for lunch. So thank you again, and we'll be back after lunch.
Done.